And I want to first talk about the most recent IPCC report and about COP26. So I'm very late to the ball game on the IPCC report. For those who don't know, IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And essentially, this is a large board of scientists who are using data coming in from a variety of observatories throughout the country and the world to make predictions about climate change. And they put out reports periodically about how we're doing in fighting the climate crisis. Spoiler alert, it's bad. And in fact, the most recent IPCC report that came out said that instead of having so originally, it was thought that we had until 2030, which is 9 years away, or 2050, which is 29 years away. It turns out that in order to reverse catastrophic climate change, we had, at the time the report came out, which was 3 months ago now, I think, or 2 months ago, let's say 2, about 17 months to start making major revisions. So obviously, the problem is we now have about 15 months left, and we definitely haven't done anything. So part of this process to move forward involves a conference called COP26. 26, I believe, is just the 26th iteration. And I don't remember what COP stands for, but it has to do with climate. And essentially, we have to, as a world, start to make real progress on climate change, or else we are going to be fucked. And so this conference, this COP26, I believe it's happening in Scotland this year, very shortly, is to essentially for the world together and to come to an agreement about what can be done about climate change. So in anticipation of this conference, there has been a pre-conference, and at this conference, a friend of the show, Greta Thunberg, has been speaking, I would say at, not really to, world politicians, as well as lots of other youth climate activists who are essentially reminding our politicians, but in a sterner way, that we are running out of time. And it is going to eventually get to the point where it is too late, where the prioritization of the profits of a select group of individuals is going to create a situation where life on this planet is no longer sustainable. So, obviously, we need these voices to not fall on deaf ears. But unfortunately, it seems like for the most part, they are falling on deaf ears. So regardless of how scathing the criticisms are, and by the way, Greta had a great speech where she essentially said, you know, all of your plans, blah, 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 right? We've had blah, blah, blah for 30 years. And it's essentially, it's pretty words that mean nothing. And she has a point, because the truth is, regardless of what you call your climate plan, we have not been moving in that direction. And actually, a new report came out about which countries are actually keeping pace with their climate promises for the Paris Accords. Now, just as a reminder, the Paris Climate Accords were not nearly enough. And in fact, when they were passed in, I think, 2017, Nicaragua specifically did not come on board. And that seems strange, right? But they said, this doesn't go far enough, we cannot sign into this. Now, eventually they changed their tune, and now the only country that had not signed into the Paris Climate Accords was the United States. I believe as a technicality, we are back in now, but not in any, meaningful way. And so this report came out to show, hey, how we're doing. It's essentially a report card for how is the world doing in tackling climate change. And spoiler alert, it's also very bad because there is only one nation out of the over 200 nations that are signatories to the Paris Accord who are actually keeping pace with their climate obligations. You want to guess what country that is? I'll wait. No, it's the Gambia. The Gambia is the only nation on this whole blue ball in space that is keeping up with their climate promises. And by the way, part of that is because the Gambia generates almost no pollution whatsoever. And by the way, most of these countries, and I'm going to talk about this in my next segment, most of the countries who are suffering right now from climate change do not actually produce that many greenhouse emissions. So obviously, this is a problem that is, although the deleterious effects of climate change will affect smaller, poorer nations first, larger, richer nations are the primary ones driving the move towards a catastrophic climate situation. And this is really unfortunate because in a lot of these countries that are richer, that are producing a lot of the fossil fuels and carbon emissions, many of the corporations that are primarily responsible for this are actually the ones who are benefiting the most from all of this, right? They are these corporations who benefit from this don't want to lose out on those profits because we're a capitalist system where profits rule everything. So they have commodified elections. They've taken over governments where they've needed to, either through campaign contributions, bribes, or through other means like influence peddling and such things, and sponsorships and the like, or just straight out bribery, where profits have been allowed to stop climate policy from going into effect. Also, it's important to remember that in most countries, in most rich countries, the climate policies that have been proposed have been pretty weak and don't even come close to the Paris Accords, which, as I mentioned earlier, don't go far enough to protect us against an inevitably rapidly warming climate. And the truth is, that's not really that surprising. The other thing that I want to point out here is that, and I feel this is important to remind ourselves of whenever we're talking about climate change, is that we're not killing the Earth. The Earth, as a planet, is going to be fine without us, and did just fine when there was no life on it whatsoever. What we are doing is killing ourselves. And there is a great sculpture, and I forget where it is, but it's essentially it's stone carved onto a brick, and this brick is laid a little low under the rest of the pavement, so it floods routinely, even when it rains or there's a little puddle or whatever. And it's called Politicians Arguing About Climate Change. And when the puddle fills, you can see that the politicians are drowning, but still debating it, right? And the message there, of course, is that regardless of what happens with anything else that we're doing, politicians are going to keep arguing over this because they are not incentivized to actually move us forward in a direction that will save us. It's not about saving the planet. It's about saving us. We are on the chopping block because eventually this world will become too hot for us to inhabit. And it might be within my lifetime, which is terrifying. I cannot possibly imagine what it is going to be like. But, I'm still worried about it. And obviously, I live in a richer country. I have some luxuries that many people on Earth do not have, which is, I may be able to move. My government may be able to have resources for me if things get really bad. And I like to bring up something that AOC said when she was talking about the Green New Deal. And I think this applies generally to all climate policy. The question is not, can we afford the climate policy, as expensive as it might seem on paper, but can we afford not to have climate policy? And the reason that she talks about this is because, in truth, regardless of what we do, regardless of the amount of money we spend on climate policy or don't spend on climate policy, what will inevitably end up happening is that when things go to shit, and by the way, they will, and they are doing now. Quick pause. We are in climate change now. Climate change is not some far off future event that we are eventually going to get to and don't have to think about. It's happening right now. And I'll talk about some examples shortly after this. But when things go to shit, someone will have to pay for it, either to pay to fix bridges or to move people out of flooded areas or to save people from wildfires or to clean up after hurricanes or whatever else it is, or to move people inland when sea levels eventually rise. And that's all going to cost money. But as the old saying goes, a pinch of prevention is worth a pound of cure. or a penny of prevention is worth a pound of cure, whichever way you like that particular, what's it called? You know what I mean. But the truth is, we're going to end up paying for climate catastrophe whether we like it or not. So the question is, when do we start paying for it? Do we pay for it with lives, with blood and treasure? When people start dying, when wars start being fought over water, when people start to lose their homes because they're flooded or they can't farm anymore? Or do we start paying for it now to make sure that when climate change gets worse, and it will, that we have a robust defense and that we have taken steps to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change? If we do not do that, we will get to a situation where it becomes a fight of the fittest. And unfortunately, richer, whiter nations will win out just because they have the resources. We will essentially be participating as rich nations in the mass genocide of poor nations and countries. And if we do not start now making an effort to change the way that our economy and our world is set up, and by the way, that starts at COP26, that starts by taking the IPCC report seriously. If we don't do it now, we are going to have incredible, incredible amounts of blood on our hands later. And I, for one, don't think that's acceptable. I believe we need to start now. And I know many people agree with me, but we have to push those people in power to move away from their financial interests, move away from their financial incentives. And we need to make a concerted effort to remove corporate money from politics, not just in this country, but in all countries. Coal companies and oil companies and gas companies should not have more say, or any say, quite frankly, than regular people who are losing their homes, who are losing their livelihoods because of climate change. We don't get a choice about climate change happening. It's going to happen. But we do get a choice about how bad it gets. And the truth of the matter is, we can exercise some level of control about how bad it gets. So we need to do that. And we need to start now. Truthfully, we needed to start years ago, but we can't go back in time. What we need to do now is to make sure that at COP26, when we actually have in the room every world leader, everyone who can make a difference on this, that we actually start to make a difference. Because we're already seeing climate change. We had floods in China. We had floods in Germany. We had hurricanes in the US. We had flooding in the US. We had wildfires in the US and other places around the world. The permafrost in Siberia is melting. The glaciers are melting. We're running out of time. And by the way, if you don't think this affects you, first of all, fuck you. And second of all, you're wrong. Italy right now is experiencing an incredible drought. And the crops that we love, like olives and grapes, are going to be affected by this. As we move forward, we have to remember that many of the foods that we eat, that we love, are tied very closely to the temperature of the locations in which they're grown. Grapes are not a particularly forgiving fruit. So for all you wine moms at home, and wine dads and wine anybody, if you like having wine, then climate change is important to you. If you like olive oil in your cooking, climate change is important to you. All of these things, fruits, vegetables, anything you can think of, anything that comes from the ground, essentially, those things grow because of the temperature, because of the soil, because of the way that the world is composed right now. So if we allow for climate change to change that in a fundamental way, we're going to see all the things that we love in life, as well as our families and loved ones and homes, be erased. The planet isn't dying. We are. And it's time we started to act like it.